This is the new Orient Mako III, and it's had one of the most confusing releases ever. The previous generation, the Ray 2 and Mako 2, launched back in 2016, and they were decent divers that competed with the Seiko SKX line in terms of specs, but failed to achieve the same cult classic status. In recent years, Orient fans have hoped for a refresh to help their favourite brand overcome the competition. Fortunately for them, Orient kind of delivered from 2019 onward, firing out numerous dive-style models to meet demand such as this, and a whole bunch of these. While the vintage reissues were clearly not a Mako replacement, the identity of the other models wasn't so clear. Some of these kind of looked like the Mako, and some had near identical specs too, but Orient never clarified if any were actually Mako watches, instead granting them all the catchy name Diver Design Model in their press releases. Understandably, many reviewers guessed or speculated that one of these must be the new Mako III, given the vague naming scheme and the constant rumours. In February this year, Orient finally broke their silence and announced the actual Mako III. Thanks to Tom at TUS Watches for giving me the heads up on this one. Even in their press release for this one, it isn't even referred to as the Mako III, but it is mentioned as actually being part of the Mako series this time, which is good enough for me. Naming shenanigans aside, how does this compare to the previous gen Ray and Mako 2, as well as all those other recent Orient divers? Towards the end of the video, I'll also be comparing this to the recent Seiko 5 launches, and then giving it an overall value rating out of 10, so stick around to see how well it scores. All watches I'm mentioning today will be linked in the video description, and big thanks to TUS for providing this Mako 3 review sample. Okay, so the packaging is nothing new, but I was genuinely shocked by how much better this watch looked straight out of the box. Now, while the Mako 2 and Ray 2 were competent divers, I wouldn't say they were lookers as such. The Mako 2 in particular looks quite dated by modern standards, and both models were pretty generic with no eye-catching colours or design cues. This new one though, I wish I'd remembered to turn on the mic when unboxing, because the words that came out of my mouth were something along the lines of, "This is fit." There are a few things they've done here that clearly result in such a huge visual upgrade over the Mako 2. Firstly, they've obviously introduced a radical new colour. I don't think you would have found a burnt orange like this on previous gen Orient offerings, and man, am I glad they've tried it. I've seen all the new Seiko 5 dive style watches in the windows of jewelers. They've got all sorts of wacky stuff in there these days, especially with all the collab pieces. The orange that Orient has gone for here might not be quite as bright as that, but in combination with the bezel, the whole thing here looks very classy. In fact, the bezel really is quite different this time round. Those on the old Mako and Ray were very angular, which contributed to the overall thickness, and it made them look a tiny bit stubby. That fitted to the Mako 3 has the same flat Seiko style profile that we saw back on the Kamasu, and looks a fair amount sleeker as a result. It also marginally reduces the thickness of the watch, which never hurts. Perhaps the most impressive part of the bezel is the aesthetic of it though. Unlike previous collections where the bezels simply match the dial colour, Orient has implemented a carefully selected two-tone design across the Mako 3 lineup, which I think looks killer. For this orange-red option, the tone of the dial sits halfway between the two colours used on the bezel, resulting in a pleasing three-stage arrangement. I think my favourite is actually that lighter colour. It's almost like a coffee brown or some sort of bronze, and I've never quite seen that tone used on a watch before. For some reason, I think that part alone makes the watch look far more high-end from a distance, and it gives it some unexpected elegance. I've seen footage of the other colours too, and I have to say, whoever picked them, I think you've done a stellar job. These all look far more attractive and interesting than the previous gen models, which I always felt were a bit vanilla, but these should be better considering the price. Unfortunately, I don't think the bezel action is quite as good as before. Here there's far more recoil and a less satisfying noise, though I doubt many of you at home take diving seriously enough to be bothered by this. While the visuals are pretty unique on the surface, in many ways this watch is actually a reskin of the Kamasu I mentioned earlier. Not only is the bezel the same shape, but the overall sizing is identical too, at 41.8mm in diameter, a thickness of 12.9mm, and a lug-to-lug of 46.5. The shape and finishing of the case are virtually the same too, though perhaps the brushing is a tad neater here than on its predecessor. That could just be my old garbage cameras though. As a result of this case cloning, apparently any third-party bracelets that you've purchased to fit the Kamasu will also fit here as well. On wrist, the watch certainly wears smaller than the diameter indicates, partly because of the short lug-to-lug, but also because of the female end links. The flexibility really allows this to accommodate smaller wrists just as well as large ones. I'd say this wears more like a typical 39.5 or 40mm watch rather than approaching 42mm, and it certainly feels smaller than the newer Seiko 5s, which we'll get to shortly. One minor upgrade versus previous Orient divers is the crown, which is fractionally larger and much grippier. You still get the same 20 bar water resistance rating and an identical screwed rear too. Under the hood is the familiar F6922 automatic, which you'll find in several other day-date Orient models. My unit clocked in with an accuracy of about -6 seconds per day, which is okay. The bracelet's also really similar to the Kamasu, and it's more than sufficient for this fairly affordable watch, with solid steel links, except for those end links, and it even comes with a fold-over clasp that houses a generous 4 micro-adjustment holes. Unlike some of the watches I've covered recently, you'll probably find a good fit with the Mako 3. If I had to be picky, I think this bracelet could do with more of a taper to it, as in its current state, it's pretty chunky considering the size of the watch. You can also tell that this is more of a stock bracelet that's used across multiple models, as its contours don't properly match the lugs. Now, I don't have experience with the bracelets fitted to the previous gen models, as mine came fitted on the rubber strap instead. That said, after watching some videos, this looks like a mild step up in finishing and build quality, primarily because of the clasp. Another upgrade versus last gen is the crystal. Here, it's not mineral or some gimmicky hardened mineral glass, it is sapphire, just like the Kamasu. This is more scratch resistant than the typical glass fitted to the old Mako or Ray models, as well as the relatively new Kano, which surprisingly only houses a mineral crystal too. Sapphire is a nice improvement, though the anti-reflective coating, if it has any, certainly isn't the best. It's not particularly clear and it doesn't handle reflections as well as the rival Seiko SRPD. In fact, let's talk a little about that. If you're in the market for an affordable diver, then chances are you could well be trying to choose between this new Mako 3 and the Seiko SRPD divers. These are the ones that look just like the old Seiko SKX. I definitely think Orient has taken some inspiration from Seiko in the way that they've revived this model with minor modern design twists and some more exuberant colorways. However, there are some clear differences to consider. Firstly, the wear experience varies a little despite these similar on-paper proportions. The Seiko is definitely a more bulbous diver, and it's got a much sportier overall look. This new Orient is slightly more muted and feels like it takes a step towards the dressier end of the spectrum, which is echoed by the more contoured K-shape and reduced thickness. Out of these two, the Orient feels considerably smaller, though the new 38mm version of the Seiko may be a better option still for thinner arms. In tune with a more playful appearance, the SRPD is essentially a dive style watch. While the 100 meters of water resistance is more than serviceable for most scenarios, if you're after a watch you can submerge time and time again, you'll probably want to go with the better equipped Mako 3, which offers double that. In terms of fit and finish, I'd say both are about the same, with little perceivable differences between the two. Similar can be said about the movement. They've both got the same mediocre beat rate, and these two units have comparable accuracy, though I will say the Seiko does have a quieter rotor. In terms of lume, disappointingly the Mako 3 is no better than the Mako 2, meaning the Seiko comfortably has it beaten in low light. But the Seiko falls short in the crystal department. Despite costing considerably more than the SKX it replaced, it still uses the same Hardlex mineral crystal, which is far more scratch prone than the sapphire on the Mako 3. Like with the SKX replacement, the Mako replacement has received a price bump from Orient. These are currently selling for just under £250 on TUS Watches, which I think equates to about $310 US. Here in the UK, that's a similar cost to the Seiko, which itself varies wildly in price depending on which version you go for. This means the Mako 3 is slightly more than all the Orient divers I mentioned earlier, and £100 more than the previous gen Mako 2. Of course, for authorized dealers, it's essentially Orient who dictates the price of these. Now, some of these price rises are probably due to inflation, but maybe there's a touch of greedflation in there too. Is this a much better looking watch than the Mako 2? Well, in person, yes, it clearly is. Are the slight changes worth a 68% price increase? Personally, I'm not entirely convinced. As such, I'm giving this a value rating of 7.5 out of 10. It's reasonable in isolation, and it's not often you can get a watch that looks this nice at this price, so I have to give them credit for that. But other Orients offer similar specs and designs for less money. If this was, say, £199 where I'd love it to be, it would undoubtedly be scoring higher. In fact, this is such a nice looking watch, I've decided we should give watches a style rating too. Like, how good looking is this watch from a purely visual standpoint? Well, I'm giving this orange one specifically an 8.6 for style. I never expected Orient to make a dive watch that looks this good. It's linked down below along with the other watches I mentioned today. 2 things you need to know before you watch any more of my videos. You can have your say on the watches I review by giving them a star rating in the description. just click the link next to the rating of your choice. It's that easy and you don't sign up for anything. These polls will be in all video descriptions moving forward because I want you, the viewers, to be able to see like the general consensus about watches, not just my opinion. In addition, I've also created a review suggestion tool that you can use, which you'll also find in every description moving forward. If there's a particular watch or video topic you think I should cover, just complete the form and maybe your suggestion will make it to a future video.